The man who has caused the most damage to Scott Morrison's election campaign isn't Anthony Albanese. It isn't the Mean Girls or even the miserable ghost of Malcolm Turnbull. No, the man who has tried his utmost to derail the Coalition's campaign is this inept pretender.
I certainly don't want to cancel Katherine Deves or silence her whatsoever.
What you're doing is you're joining a media leftist pylon that has taken little snippets of what she said, has exaggerated them, has been deceptive about them.
But there is a line, and I think hate speech or hurtful speech is inappropriate in our public discourse. We can be better than that. You and I are having a very robust discussion here, Chris, and that's what we want in our democracy. But there are ways to carry it out, and I'm saying I don't think the way that individual carried out this debate was appropriate or helpful in the public discourse.
It's a gross exaggeration to call it hate speech.
You know, Matt Kean talks about using respectful language. He talks about respectful debate. But he knows perfectly well that Katherine Deves has for more than a week now been subjected to the most vile, ugly, misogynistic abuse, and yet he keeps attacking her. Even after the PM backed her, he kept attacking her. Even after former Prime Ministers Tony Abbott and John Howard joined Scott Morrison in backing Deves, Kean kept up the attack. Even after his own leader, Premier Dominic Perrottet, backed Deves, Kean was back on radio, making a fool of himself and the Liberals, who've allowed this imposter to have so much power within the party. Here is Matt Kean with Ben Fordham from this morning.
If it's the substantive issue, why not weigh into that? Why do you focus on some comments that she's made that she says that she regrets? And more so, why are you undermining the Prime Minister, the Premier and the first female President of the Liberal Party who considered all of the candidates and backed Katherine Deves?
Well, the last thing I'm doing is undermining the Prime Minister or the Premier. The Premier and I are in absolute agreement that these comments were abhorrent, they are vile, and they have no place in Australian public discourse.
But the Premier has selected Katherine Deves. He was part of the committee that selected Katherine Deves for this seat of Warringah. So you are going against your own Premier.
Well, I think that's not right, Ben. I mean, these issues have arisen.
But hang on, just address that for me. How is that not right? Let me just repeat it. He was part of the committee that selected Katherine Deves, and you are now suggesting she should be disendorsed. So that is defying the wishes of your boss, the New South Wales Premier, and the Prime Minister, and the former President of the Liberal Party.
That was about the high point of the interview for Matt Kean. It only got worse from there, much, much worse. Listen here as his misrepresentations are called out one by one.
Whether it's hate speech or not. But look, as I said, she's apologised for some of those comments. You've made comments you shouldn't have made. I've made comments I shouldn't have made. Did you think of reaching out to Katherine Deves, considering she's got no experience in politics and she's on your team? Did you think of reaching out to her and saying, hey, listen, can I have a word with you? Can I give you some advice? Instead of going on Twitter and campaigning against a Liberal candidate in the middle of a federal election campaign?
Look, I'm not going to turn off my conscience because there's an election, Ben, and nor would anyone expect me to. This language is not appropriate. You know, what does it say to a young teenager struggling with their identity if a community leader is comparing them to sex offenders? What does it say to a survivor of the Holocaust?
How did she compare a young trans person to a sex offender?
Well, Ben, I mean, she said that trans people are surgically mutilated and sterilised.
Yeah, no, on the mutilation thing, she was talking about someone who had undergone surgery having breasts removed. And as I told you, there are cases going on at the moment in the UK where there are people who are taking those clinics to court over that. There is a girl called Kira Bell. She began hormone therapy at the age of 15 under the guidance of trans doctors. She had her breasts removed at the age of 20. She's now suing her doctors for the mental and physical toll that it's taken on her body. When you talk about likening young trans people to sex offenders, I don't think she did that. Can you show me where she did that?
Well, I mean, the quote here, I'm reading it, half of all transgender men are sex offenders.
She was talking about transgender men, and she was talking about the prison population.
Well, it's not appropriate language.
You've just verbaled her by suggesting, Matt, you've just verbaled Katherine Deves live on the air by saying twice now that she was comparing trans children to sex offenders. And then when you clarify the quote, you're talking about men, and she was talking about men in the male prison population or trans women in the male prison population.
There you go. The state Liberal Treasurer caught out misrepresenting the Liberal candidate for Warringah. And as you heard there, he declined to read the quote that so enraged him, that's had him raging all week to anyone who'll listen. So Ben Fordham ended up reading it for him.
Half of all males with trans identities as sex offenders compared with less than 20% for the rest of the male estate. Now, the male estate is what the UK refers to as their male prison population. And what she's talking about has been verified. It's a UK government study which showed half of trans male prisoners were sex offenders. So she correctly quoted that report. She said nothing about trans children being sex offenders. So what you've just said is a lie.
Ben, that's not correct. What I'm saying is the language that has been used here in a number of circumstances.
Well, Matt, you just used an example. You just used an example, and I challenged you to read out the quote. You didn't do so twice. I've just read it out, and I'll read it again. Here we go. Ben, quote, half of all males with trans identities are sex offenders compared with less than 20% for the rest of the male estate. Now, the male estate is the giveaway because she was referring to the male prison population in the UK. She wasn't talking about trans kids. So can you apologise for verballing her or taking her out of context just now twice on radio?
But then what I'm saying is this language, if a young person hears it, I mean, that is very hurtful. They don't know the context.
She wasn't talking about a young trans person.
So now facts are forbidden if Matt Kean thinks they'll be hurtful to somebody somewhere? This man has deliberately misrepresented Katherine Deves' arguments and comments. He has caused untold damage to the Liberals' campaign. He has caused untold damage to a Liberal woman, and I have no doubt this entire saga has discouraged other accomplished women from putting up their hand to represent the Liberal Party. Matt Kean is a useful idiot of the left, and he has no place within any coalition government. The Liberal Party may be a broad church, but if it's so broad to include the likes of the destructive, white-anting Kean, then it has lost its way.